Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research webinar. My name is Jeff and I'll be your moderator for this session. Today's topic is engaging with domestic and family violence perpetrators as fathers. Punitive approaches to perpetrators of domestic and family violence often have little effect on sustainable behaviour change. Similar results have been observed for court-mandated behaviour change programs for perpetrators of DFV. Interventions seem to be most successful where perpetrators are motivated to engage. Motivation, however, is limited in an intervention that has been forced onto its participants. It therefore seems crucial to identify motivating factors that can be used to encourage active engagement in behaviour change programs. This presentation is based on interviews with 21 perpetrators mandated to attend a behaviour change program as a result of breaching the domestic violence order. We are pleased to welcome our presenter for today, Dr. Silke Meyer. Dr. Silke Meyer is a lecturer at the Queensland Domestic and Family Violence Research Centre at the Central Queensland University. She is currently developing and delivering a new postgraduate program in domestic and family violence practice. Dr. Meyer's most recent projects include an examination of cultural and regional differences in women's experiences of domestic and family violence and related housing instabilities, and men's non-compliance or compliance with domestic violence orders with focus on the role of fatherhood identity. This webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter, which can be typed into the chat box which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you are experiencing any difficulty hearing the sound during the webinar, please dial the 1-800 support number listed in the chat box. I'd now like to pass you over to Silke to begin.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on engaging with domestic and family violence perpetrators as fathers. I'd like to start with a brief overview and a framework around the feminist framework addressing issues of male privilege and male entitlement, and then have a quick look at the historical invisibility of fathers in policy and practice to kind of frame the background for why we've seen a lack of engaging with perpetrators as fathers in the past and how that might shift with current changes and shifts towards a greater focus on actually working with fathers in family safety and family welfare-based interventions. And then I'll move on to the actual research results that Jeff just introduced based on a study with 21 perpetrators court-mandated into a men's behaviour change program, and having a look at the complex issues, to what extent a feminist framework is useful, and how and why we might need to go beyond that and take a more holistic approach to engaging with fathers as perpetrators. And then wrapping it up, how fatherhood identity might be one of those, points of or angles of motivation to get fathers and perpetrators more engaged in actually wanting to change and being committed to engaging in behaviour change programs. So starting with a bit of a background, we know from a lot of Australian and really international worldwide research that domestic and family violence is primarily a gender problem, and it's primarily ongoingly so male to female perpetrated. We know that in a lot of cases, patriarchy and a sense of male privilege and male entitlement plays a key role in families affected by domestic and family violence. That doesn't necessarily always mean that all families affected by domestic and family violence also see elements of coercive control, systematic oppression, manipulation, and the perpetrator's desire to exercise and maintain power over the victim and possibly the whole family unit. But that is obviously present in a number of cases of domestic and family violence. However, what we find from the literature and what you'll see also from the research findings that I'm presenting today is that those stereotypical beliefs around gender roles, around male privilege and male entitlement seem to be present in the vast majority of cases. So they're not necessarily always involving those patterns of control and power dynamics, but certainly a male sense of privilege and entitlement and having expectations of what their female partners should comply with in terms of their expectations of what women should do within the family unit, within the household, and within intimate relationships. So that kind of suggests that a feminist framework is necessary to form the foundation for any type of male behavior change programs, engagement with men who use violence against women in intimate relationships. But it's also obvious from a number of practitioner and research accounts, and it's certainly clearly come out of my research, that for a lot of families, the issues are much more complex than just those stereotypical beliefs around gender roles and patriarchy and male privilege and entitlement. So that research suggests that there needs to be a more holistic approach to actually addressing these issues and engaging with men that use violence against an intimate partner. So having a quick look at what fathering and child safety, or that interface of fathering and child safety in the context of domestic and family violence actually looks like. You would know from a practice perspective, and we know certainly from the research evidence and research-based surveys, that relationships don't necessarily end because there's domestic and family violence involved. In a lot of cases, couples don't necessarily separate, partly because of issues of control and fear, as I raised earlier, in terms of where there's really severe levels of coercive control involved, but also because there's a lot of families affected by domestic and family violence and a complex range of underlying issues where victims will often report they want the violence to stop, they want the perpetrator to be non-violent in the relationship, but they don't necessarily want the relationship to end. So we need to account for those types of relationships where when the family unit doesn't break up because there's domestic and family violence involved, obviously we need to look at interventions that can make relationships and parenting safer within that ongoing family formation. The other issue is that for those victims who do separate, a lot of them realize fairly quickly post-separation that ending the relationship doesn't necessarily end the occurrences of abuse and violence. For a lot of victims, the main, key trigger or problem is the role of mutual children and ongoing contact between children and abusive parents. So we know from Australian data, from the Australian Institute for Family Studies, for example, that ongoing contact between children and the abusive parent in one form or another is quite common. For most children, abusive partners continue to play a role in their lives, whether that is through supervised contact, unsupervised contact, overnight contact, shared custody arrangements. So fathers, in a lot of cases, do remain involved in their children's lives. Whether they remain involved as an engaged parent is a different story, but they certainly do tend to continue to have contact. That's obviously problematic if domestic and family violence isn't addressed post-separation or hasn't been addressed prior to separation, because that ongoing contact, if behavior of the perpetrator doesn't change, obviously means it continues to put children at risk, because children are exposed to ongoing abusive behavior by the perpetrator against the victim, even post-separation. It puts victims at risk, because victims, in a lot of cases, have to facilitate the contact between perpetrator and children. So in a lot of cases, that gives the perpetrator access to the victim. Even if it's just temporary and handover, for example, it means it continues to offer those points of contact where the perpetrator can continue to use the children basically as a tool of ongoing abuse, power, and control, even where the victim has managed to remove herself from that abusive relationship. So the question really is, can we increase victims' and children's safety by engaging with fathers in a more, in a more proactive way, in a way that holds them socially accountable as fathers, rather than just accountable from a criminal justice perspective? I think one of the issues, if we look at the background of how we've looked at engaging fathers or perpetrators around domestic and family violence, has come out of the fact that fathers just have been invisible in policy and practice for so long historically. And that's not just domestic and family violence specific. We know, if we look at our general policies and practice, changes or shifts towards, paid parental leave for fathers, for example, are recent policy shifts and changes. In general, fathers have not played a visible role in our policies and practices around being responsible for child well-being, being responsible for child rearing, being responsible as a primary caretaker or a responsible or accountable caretaker, for example. That invisibility has been even more prominent in child protection interventions. Like if we look at some historical examinations of the role of fathers in child protection investigations or interventions, we'll see fairly quickly that the focus has always been on mothers as the primary caretaker. The focus has always been on women being responsible for child well-being, ensuring it by their own parenting practices, but also the expectation being placed on mothers to ensure that the other party's parenting practices are adequate, and if not, children were the ones expected to, and in some cases still continue to be expected to actually protect children from harm, even if that harm is caused by the other parent. So we've come across the notion of failure to protect allegations over the years, and not just in Australia. Similar research has come out of the US and Canada, for example, highlighting the issue that mothers continue to be the ones being held responsible for child well-being and children's safety, and being accused of a failure to adequately protect their children if they allow their children to be exposed to domestic and family violence, even though that violence is perpetrated by the other parent, and victims are similarly, if not more, affected by the abuse. Those types of policy and practice framework really meant for fathers that there was no expectation to engage. Historically, we know from Australian and international reviews of child protection policies and practices, for example, that initially women were expected to work harder, make things work, sort out the relationship, not to tip the perpetrator off. It's certainly something that's come out of Humphreys and Apsler's reviews recently in Australia, that was a historical theme that emerged for decades and decades, that then shifted towards expectations for women to no longer try harder and make the relationship work, but instead move out of the abusive relationship and be responsible for removing the children physically from the exposure to domestic and family violence. But again, it just continued to have no expectations for fathers to actually engage with child protection interventions. And as a result, they really had no expectations for fathers to change their behavior, because the expectation to change and ensure child safety and well-being was continuously placed on mothers. That's obviously problematic in terms of framing parental accountability, social accountability as fathers, because it really means if fathers are allowed to remain invisible in policy and practice, it also means they continuously can deny their accountability in any harmful behavior towards their children or in any wrongdoing, really. Obviously, domestic and family violence, we've seen that from a number of national and international studies over the last couple of decades, really. We know about the detrimental impacts that domestic and family violence and exposure to domestic and family violence has for children and their well-being and development. It affects behavioral issues. It increases children's risk of aggression towards other children, as well as aggression towards the abused parent in a lot of cases. We know that it has significant impacts on educational performance, engagement in school failure, truancy, which then obviously in return has an impact on later in life employability. So it really has an accumulation of effects on children affected by domestic and family violence and how they're able to perform and develop throughout, early as well as later life. It creates mental health issues for children, especially in older children. Early signs of depression are often observed, and it has a significant impact on children's ability to form respectful and healthy relationships, social relationships. Also in later life, obviously, intimate relationships, but even at an early age, it affects children's ability to form healthy forms of attachment with other children, for example. Obviously, domestic and family violence also has an impact on the parents involved. So impact on the father's own ability to parent. We know from the limited research that's out there that fathers who are abusive within the parent relationship also tend to be more rigid and authoritarian in their own parenting and disciplining expectations and techniques, for example. But are also in a lot of cases absent. So when they're present, they tend to be more authoritarian and rigid, but in a lot of cases, they're also removed and absent, really just reflecting their invisibility in their role as fathers and accountability as fathers. There's other issues of role modeling and social learning. Obviously, we know from the social learning literature that being an abusive parent increases the risk of really raising either children as victims or children as perpetrators. We know that young boys exposed to domestic and family violence have an increased risk of growing up to show aggression and violent behavior in their own later intimate relationships. And we know that girls exposed to domestic and family violence have an increased risk of becoming victims in their own later adult intimate relationships. Beyond the impact on children and the actual abusive parent's behavior, it also has a significant impact on the victim. In a lot of cases, it causes a disrupted parent-child relationship for mothers because the mother-child bond is disrupted or destroyed in a lot of cases because children are being used as a tool of abuse. The children, in some cases, are being forced to watch or participate in the abusive behavior. It creates a great deal of shame and self-blame for mothers. Mothers often report not shame and self-blame associated with having felt they haven't been able to adequately protect their children from this kind of exposure to harm. We also know from some studies that there's increased maternal depression in women exposed to domestic and family violence, which means everyday life struggles in terms of emotional coping and in some cases really just physical survival has a significant impact on whether mothers can be present as a parent, especially unfortunately then in times when the children really need them most. So it has a significant disruptive impact on mother-child relationships. We've seen a recent shift towards greater accountability of fathers in different types of policies. So, for example, in child protection, we've seen in some cases a greater focus on engaging fathers, involving fathers in general, a shift towards not solely working with mothers in families that are subject to child welfare investigations or interventions, but trying to engage the other parent, especially where parents are still co-residing. We've also seen a recent trend to some extent in a greater accountability and a greater involvement of fathers in interventions that are domestic and family violence specific. Obviously in child protection cases, for a lot of contact that occurs with families where domestic and family violence is an issue and child protection is involved, they tend to have highly complex issues. So there's a whole range of other underlying issues that may be involved in terms of housing struggles, parental substance misuse, issue of unemployment, financial stress, to potentially already manifested child problem behavior such as school failure or truancy, for example. So there are complex issues where we've seen a trend towards greater focus on trying to get fathers involved in the intervention rather than solely trying to work with mothers and children. We've also seen a shift towards greater, I would start by saying involvement of fathers in family law, which from the reviews that we've seen wasn't necessarily a good thing. While we've seen a greater focus on engaging fathers in the continuing parenting engagement, post-separation for couples that don't have domestic and family violence involved, that's great. But for cases where domestic and family violence was present, the greater assumption that children should have contact with both parents has obviously been problematic, and we've seen some reviews and reforms coming out of that. So the most recent reform suggests that children do continue to have some form of contact in most cases with the abusive parent, but we see a greater consideration of domestic and family violence in cases of, in family law proceedings, and fewer cases, according to the latest Australian Institute of Family Studies reviews, end up with shared custody where there's domestic and family violence involved, or at least where it's become known in the court proceedings. Having said that, that review also shows that many couples said domestic and family violence was never questioned or raised. So it's obviously still a matter of being able to identify that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we know that most children tend to have some sort of ongoing contact with the other parent, even if it's just once a fortnight for a day or an overnight visit. In some cases, the contact is supervised, although that seems to be the exception rather than the rule, which really highlights the importance of behavior change for perpetrators beyond criminal justice accountability and in terms of social accountability of fathers to make that kind of ongoing contact a safer kind of and more beneficial contact, especially for the children. So the other thing that we've seen around accountability is a growing trend or shift towards greater perpetrator intervention programs or greater use of perpetrator intervention programs and increasing emphasis on behavior change through accountability or perpetrator accountability through behavior change programs. So we've seen that come out of Victoria and Queensland, for example, this year and last year with the recent inquiries. A very strong emphasis on making more perpetrator intervention programs available to be able to actually work on engaging perpetrators and generating behavior change. I guess one of the challenges around perpetrator intervention programs is that the evidence is very mixed and is affected by a variety of factors. We know from international, especially international evaluations, that once program content and duration starts to differ, it affects effectiveness. So unless it's a set, well-designed, continuing long curriculum, short type of interventions tend to have very little effect on actual generating behavior change. Effectiveness also varies greatly with facilitator qualifications, which is problematic across Australia because we know that qualifications vary greatly. It also varies with the needs of participants, and we'll have a look at that in relation to this particular study in terms of being able to address complex needs beyond that feminist framework. The other issue that's often raised is the lack of motivation to change in mandated cohorts, and a lot of the programs are to some extent mandated, while perpetrators have to consent to being mandated into a men's intervention program. It is in the end, especially when it comes as a result of a breach, to some extent a forced intervention, if you want. So the question really is, how can we motivate men to change? What can commit them to engaging in behavior change program? As one of the participants in this study said, you've got to be committed if you want to make it permanent. And we know that from the research evidence around any type of behavioral attitudinal change, whether that's in the area of health and smoking or substance misuse, for example, or whether that's around weight loss, we know that unless we're committed to generating long-term permanent change is highly unlikely. So with regards to the current study, and as Jeff said earlier, it's based on 21 men that were mandated into a men's intervention program, court mandated as the result of at least one breach of a domestic violence order. Out of those 21 men, 18 were fathers. They ranged in age from 24 to 62 years, with the ones being in their 60s. The exception, the majority, was in the lower age range of between mid-20s and 30s. They were all non-Indigenous, and all but one, in terms of the fathers, were Australian-born. I guess one of the potential problems or limitations of examining men through a court-mandated behaviour change program is that they are fairly visible cohort with complex needs. So that's one of the challenges, I guess, or limitations with any kind of examination of those types of interventions, where we know from a criminological perspective that people who've had contact with criminal justice agencies, police contact, court contact, and then are then actually sentenced to something tend to be the ones more visible. They also tend to be the ones with complex needs and a range of criminogenic risk factors that actually cause them to come in contact, frequent contact often, with law enforcement agencies in the first place. So there may be some limitation in terms of perpetrators that are fairly educated, employed, and highly controlling and manipulative may be much better at avoiding police contact in the first place, and may therefore be less likely to actually end up in those type of visible court-mandated cohorts with complex needs. So that's one thing to keep in mind, I guess. The program ran for 24 weeks, and the interviews ranged anywhere from really early on in their program and only having completed the first 3 weeks, all the way up to men that had just finished the program. For the purpose of this presentation, this doesn't really matter so much, I think, because the things that reflected change for those that were further into the program were really more around their issues or their sense of privilege and entitlement. Those that were further into the program had a better understanding of how their behavior and their expectations of their partner and their abusive behavior towards their partner reflected their sense of male entitlement and male privilege. But it didn't really seem to affect how people saw their role as fathers, their desire to have contact with their children, and those types of contacts. One of the things, and this is what I meant when I say they are a visible cohort with highly complex needs, is one of the things that came out of the interviews fairly quickly, and we also had access to their criminal histories, so we're able to cross-check that, is that the majority of participants out of that father cohort had really chaotic lifestyles. The majority had criminal histories themselves for domestic violence, as well as domestic violence unrelated offenses, anything from property damage to burglary, armed robbery, producing drugs, supplying drugs, all sorts of complex, and I guess chaotic type of reflections of their lifestyles. Quite a few of them also had parents with criminal history, so in their interviews they talked about the absence of their father in a lot of cases because the fathers had been incarcerated for a certain period of time. Quite a few of them had histories of abuse and neglect themselves. The really interesting thing I found, which really then reflected the normalization of violence and abuse for quite a few of these men, was the inconsistency between their intake records and their interview description. So we had access to their intake records into the program, where they were assessed based on, or they were asked about their parents' disciplining behavior, whether they had been, physically abused as a child, whether their parents would hit them as a child, all sorts of things. So in the intake records, they would usually say no to any experiences of physical abuse or experiences of abuse and neglect in general. But when they discussed their relationship with their parents and their upbringing in the interviews, they would often touch on things that from a, I guess, a research and a practice perspective, were very obviously issues of abuse and neglect, but to them just seemed completely normal, which then often for them translated into a normalization of that kind of behavior towards their own children, towards their partner, and really towards any extended family. In a lot of cases, in their communication, it was very reflective of the way they talked to not just their partners, but also other family members, which was, to an outsider, abusive and inappropriate, but because that's the way they had been spoken to in their upbringing, and because that's the way they communicated with their mates and their siblings, for example, it just seemed to be completely normalized for them. A lot of them also had experiences with child safety interventions, some recently for occurrences of domestic and family violence, but other also historical child safety interventions for parental substance misuse, reports of neglect or direct abuse of the children. The majority of them had inconsistent employment patterns, and quite a few had left school below grade 10. So these are all, I guess, type of risk factors that we know from a criminological perspective, from a sociological perspective. We know that an accumulation of these risk factors makes, I guess, family life and in general compliance and pro-social behavior problematic for people. A lot of them also had volatile relationships. So out of the 18 fathers, eight were what were classified into volatile relationships because they had allegations of reciprocal violence between the couple. They alleged that their partners also used drugs or alcohol, and not so much in a context of finger pointing or excusing their own behavior, but in the discussions of the open-ended questions of the interview. They would describe their relationship, what they used to do with their partner, and these things would come up as how they used to use drugs together, how mates would come over, how people would drink together, what people would do, how drunk they would get, how things would then escalate or not. In a lot of cases, these things were just described as their, I guess, everyday lifestyles. More so than the victims, the perpetrators had drug and alcohol misuse issues. As I said earlier, pretty much I would say all of them had some sort of patriarchal beliefs around male privilege, male entitlement, about the role their partner should play in the intimate relationship, what the partner should do, what the partner is entitled to. So they were certainly candidates for a men's intervention program that has an underlying feminist framework, because these things needed to be addressed. But all the other complex issues within their relationships, their lifestyles, their employment opportunities, their criminal histories also called for other types of interventions. A lot of them had poor conflict resolution skills and poor communication skills, and this is what I said earlier in terms of their upbringing. A lot of them had been brought up in families where poor conflict resolution skills and poor communication skills were just everyday practice amongst their own parents, and that's how they interacted, not just with their partner, but also with their mates and their siblings, and still with their own parents to some extent. So I think that's also one of the reasons why a lot of them really struggled with the concept of being breached for verbal abuse on their domestic violence order, because that was the way they communicated with people all their lives, and all of a sudden, because there was an order in place, this attracted criminal sanctions, which some of them seemed to struggle with, unless they were further into the program and had kind of started to get a grasp of how verbal abuse really, or how the verbal use of certain types of terminology really constitutes the use of violence. Another thing that came out of quite a few of the volatile relationships was what I labeled for the purpose of data analysis as revenge cheating, where couples would cheat on each other to get back at each other for their abusive behavior. So one would be abusive, and the other one would then allegedly sleep with the perpetrator's mate to get back at him, or he would do the same. She would have called the police for an intervention, and to get back at her, he would sleep with one of her mates. So this seemed to be a fairly common dysfunctional tool of, I guess, ongoing abuse and retaliatory violence. In terms of their domestic violence order breaches, all of them had obviously breached because they had been court-ordered into the program as the result of their breaches. Some of them only had that one breach that got them into the program, and according to their exit reports and their criminal histories, had no subsequent breaches while on the program. Others had ongoing breaches during the program as well as post-program completion. In terms of the consequences of the breaches, 7 of the 18 fathers ended up in custody, the majority short-term with watch house experience, so they were arrested and held in custody until they got out on bail or were released. 5 of them actually were sentenced to custodial sentences for a breach of their domestic violence order. Now, when I say for a breach, in a lot of cases, those that actually got a custodial sentence were sentenced for another offense in the context of the domestic violence order breach. So they didn't necessarily receive a custodial sentence of 3 months for breaching the DVO by verbal abuse or threats via text message, but more likely because the incident of the domestic violence order breach actually involved a serious type of assault, for example. A couple of the perpetrators received extensions of their domestic violence orders, and a couple of them received fines. In one case, those fines had accumulated up to $10,000. The fines in themselves, we know from research and practice, are problematic in themselves because they often put pressure on the victim. The victim may be expected to contribute to paying off those fines. They're associated with financial hardship, which then again has an impact on family life and the risk of subsequent violence. So having that kind of accumulation of fines had no deterrent effect on perpetrators, but certainly had a significant impact on family life and the relationship. In terms of fatherhood, as I said, so 18 of the perpetrators had children. 4 only had children with a previous partner, meaning they were currently not living with that partner and were currently not living with those children, and those children were usually teenagers or already young adults. 14 of those 18 fathers had dependent children with the most recent victim, and quite a substantial number of them had young children under the age of 5. So that really goes to show in a lot of cases, and then 11 of those fathers were still living with a partner, so the victim and the mutual children. So that really shows that fathers continue to play a significant role in their children's lives. In a lot of cases because families don't separate, but even where they do separate, they tend to have some form of ongoing contact. In the 18 fathers, we only had one father who had no contact or visitation right with his children. One temporarily had supervised contact, which was problematic for various reasons, but that was the only one that actually had supervised contact, and then one just had regular visitations once a fortnight over the weekend. In terms of the situational circumstances of perpetrators' breaches of their domestic violence orders, I've separated them out into existing couples and separated couples. So for the existing ones, their breaches often occurred in the context of their just complex and chaotic lifestyles, often under the influence of one or both party, under the influence of drugs or alcohol, around parenting practices, child-rearing practices, around money, financial hardship, loss of employment, jealousy, in a lot of cases, from what we know from the literature and gathered from the interviews, unsubstantiated, but still an ongoing theme and issue. And then, as I raised earlier, those issues of entitlement and those ongoing perceptions of what the partners really should play in terms of their role in the relationship, in the family unit, in the household. In that overall cohort of the 21 men, we had 3 that, based on their criminal history and what they discussed when we observed those perpetrator intervention program sessions, 3 with an obvious pattern of control and serious abuse. And that was reflected in that child's contact. So that was the one father that had no ongoing contact with his children, the one that had supervised contact, and then one that was actually, during the period that we observed the perpetrator intervention program, at some stage had child safety remove the children and place them into care. So there may be some reflection that there is already some assessment going on that adequately reflects the risk to children, and then actually the father engagement in the contact for fathers. In terms of the situational circumstances for the separated couples, and that includes some couples that had temporarily separated but then moved on, the primary context in which breaches occurred seemed to be around custody and visitation, where parents argued over who's got the children when, whether somebody's picking them up too late or too early, whether somebody's withholding them when somebody would like to have them for their birthday, but also fathers accusing the victim of neglectful behavior. There were quite a few fathers who talked about handover where the victim was driving under the influence, or they believed the victim was actually unlicensed and driving, and where they withheld the children, refused to hand them over, and as a result were charged with withholding the children, kidnapping the children in one case, and were breached for their domestic violence orders. So in those types of contexts, verbal abuse and threats were the most common breaches via text, in person, or over the phone. This is from one of the interviews where one of the fathers said, "I used a lot of bad language, but you dangle someone's kids in front of them and that's going to happen. I acted badly, whether it be verbally or not. I still acted badly. Things I said I blew right out of the water, but you could plainly see what it was over. It was not over jealousy of her. It's not over her. It's not over anyone else. It's got to do with my children." So you can see, and this has come out of quite a few interviews, there's some acknowledgement of wrongdoing where perpetrators say, even if it was just verbal abuse, and they're coming to terms with the fact that abusive language is domestic violence. But they would also usually be able to justify their breaches one way or another. A lot of them argue that they really breached for what I call for the greater good, so they breached in the best interest or the protective interest of their children from their own perception. I think for many of them, they seem to be stuck between the reality of the repercussions they experience for breaching a domestic violence order, but also their fatherhood identity, what it meant for them to be a father, and what kind of responsibilities they thought they had in relation to their children. So as I said earlier, some talked about the need to, or the perception that they needed to protect the children from the other parent, especially where there was alleged substance misuse on behalf of the other parent. In quite a few cases, the breaches were associated with wanting to see the children out of schedule, and some were concerned at some stage about the increasing severity of punishment that they received for continuous or repeated domestic violence order breaches. But the bottom line for most of them was that they'd do it again if what they felt was what they had to do. So one of the fathers said, "I think it was rational and irrespective of the outcome. If it was to prevent potential dangers that are involved with excessive alcohol intake and driving, I'd probably go through the same actions again." Another father said, "As a breach, yep, I understand. But then at that time, I hadn't been in jail. I desperately wanted to see my son. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to know that he was okay. And I'd probably still do it again knowing what I know." So both fathers described relationships and had temporarily separated, were back together with the victim, and talked about the victim and their own substance misuse issues. And both of them described how, while they understand the consequences they got for it, they would probably do the same thing again. One of the things that emerged from the interviews is that fathers seem to have very limited awareness of the impact of the violence and it had on their children. And I think we know that in general, not just from perpetrators, also from victims, there's often a general assumption that if the children aren't directly target of the abuse, if the children are asleep, if the children are playing outside, if the children are basically in a different room, they're not affected. So they seem to have a complete lack of understanding of how much children actually pick up, even if they're not direct target of the abuse, and how much that actually affects their well-being and their development. What I did have an awareness of was the impact it had on their relationship with their children. For a lot of them, unfortunately, what they often describe as too late, because they had already realized that having been incarcerated meant they lost contact with the children, and post-incarceration, some of the victims had moved on. They started to realize that limited contact with the children really meant they missed out on their children growing up, and they had a disrupted parent-child relationship because the abuse had caused the children to distance themselves, especially then older children, and if given the opportunity, the children would choose spending time with mum over spending time with dad. So this is just another example where one of the fathers said, my son had gone from 2 to 3 years. This was during a temporary separation, and they were back together at the end of our interviews. I did find out where she was living. I drove down the street where they lived and went, wow, this is next door to another client of mine who I do annual deck oiling for. I'd better inspect to see whether his deck needs oiling. So I went in the backyard. I could hear my son play in the backyard next door. I went down on their pontoon because it was on the Kuma River, and I saw my son play. It just broke my heart. I just started crying. I left quickly before my ex-partner saw me, and I got in my car, and I was like determined, I've got to get my son back. This is the same father that said earlier that having to do it again, he would do the same thing again. So he was breached for another time where he came up wanting to see his son out of schedule, and he said he just needed to see his son and he would do the same thing again. So in terms of the implication this has for engaging fathers, we know from the research as well as this study shows there seems to be very limited deterrent effect in criminal justice repercussions. So being fined, being ordered to community-based sentences, being ordered to sentenced to custodial sentences, seems to have no impact on fathers or perpetrators actually wanting to change their behavior. What fathers did voice very clearly was their desire to actually be involved with their children, but a lot of them didn't know how to be a good father, partly based on their own poor experiences of parent-child relationships in their upbringing, partly because they parented within very chaotic lifestyles and volatile relationships, which really need a more complex addressing of the issues, a more holistic intervention than just addressing the power imbalances or the patriarchal beliefs present within the intimate relationship. As I said earlier, they also fathered in a context of a normalization of violence and aggression, partly that's come out of their own upbringing, and then having those stereotypical gender role perceptions of parenting and role of mothers and role of the intimate partner. What it does indicate, though, is a desire to change for the sake of their children when fathers realize that their behavior had an adverse effect on being able to maintain a relationship with their children. Obviously, in terms of any implications, the first and priority step needs to be making sure that child safety and well-being is a priority matter. So that needs to be addressed at various levels of interventions where people need to be able, practitioners need to be able to identify the risk and presence of coercive control and whether perpetrators' desire to have a relationship with their children is self-serving or whether they actually have genuine intentions about fatherhood and their role as fathers. So that needs to be addressed at the level of applications for domestic violence orders and whether maybe temporarily children should not be having contact with their fathers until fathers can engage and demonstrate behavior change. At the criminal justice system level when it comes to repercussions for breaches, for example, where children may not initially be named on the order, but if children are always the point of contact or the ones bearing the brunt of subsequent point breaches, then that may need to be considered at the level of the criminal justice interventions for breaching domestic violence orders, obviously at the level of child protection interventions, and then also at the family law level where decisions are being made of whether contact can be supervised or unsupervised, whether contact can be overnight or not. So these types of decisions at those various levels really need to be well informed, and they need to facilitate better management of handovers, because we know, not just from this particular research but also from a number of other studies, that child contact is one of the key issues associated with domestic violence order breaches, and offers an ongoing point or trigger for ongoing abuse. So in terms of motivating perpetrators to change, the focus on fatherhood and perpetrators' role and fathers and their desire to be a father may be a point that we can use as a motivational factor to actually get them engaged in behavior change programs. In order for that to work, I think perpetrator interventions really need to highlight two things: the impact domestic and family violence has on child well-being and child development, but also the impact that it has on the father-child relationship. Because what's come out of my research really has been that a lot of the fathers wish they had realized much sooner what they were doing, partly to their children, and maybe even more so to their relationship with their children and their ability to maintaining a relationship with their children. And the other thing I think it also needs to emphasize is that foreseeing into the future and the repercussions of ongoing abusive behavior by highlighting the impacts that domestic and family violence-related consequences also have on the parent-child relationship. So in experiencing repercussions like custodial sentences, for example, have obviously a significant impact on the father's ability to bond with the children, to have ongoing contact with the children while in custody, and minimizes the opportunity to be a father in the first place. So to increase engagement and motivation to change, I think these are really two things that we need to focus on in terms of highlighting to fathers why it's worthwhile considering changing for the sake of their children. And then just wrapping it up with some implications for additional support, as I said, and this may be limited to those visible court cohorts with highly complex needs, but we know that a lot of couples don't necessarily separate permanently because there's domestic and family violence involved. And for those families where domestic and family violence is part of complex, volatile relationships, there's a number of other underlying issues such as substance misuse and those poor communication skills, issues of education, employment, financial hardship, and housing instabilities that really need to be addressed at the family level in order to offer more, I guess, holistic or multi-layered responses that have a feminist framework to start with to address the violence within the intimate relationship, but are able to go beyond that and address those underlying complexities to help both parties move on one way or another. Because the other thing we know from research and practice is that unless we address those underlying issues, even if couples separate, they're likely to move into similar relationships again in the future. So for victims, that means they're likely to move into similarly abusive relationships. And for perpetrators, statistically, we know it means they're moving on and continue to victimize another partner then. So for, I guess for their own safety, but also for their overall parenting capacity and child welfare, in some cases, both parties may need support with addressing underlying issues. So just to wrap this up on a positive note, one of the fathers that I interviewed said, at the same time, being a father, being a parent is being a role model. So I've got to show my kids how to grow up and how to behave and how to do things right and know wrong from right. Instead of doing the wrong thing, I need to do the right thing. So that desire to actually be a better role model might just be an angle we can use in order to motivate perpetrators to engage in behavior change programs. Thank you very much. I'm happy to address some of your questions now. Jeff, am I on air or are you? Do you want me to just go ahead and read out some of the questions? Okay.
If you like, I can if you like.
Oh, I can, I mean, I'm happy either way. I can read them out. So we've got a question asking whether those policy structures and the invisibility of fathers in policy structures might be the reason why perpetrator treatment and services don't seem to attract the same attention and funding support. I think partly yes. I think that invisibility and that lack of social accountability, because I think over the last decade, if we've seen anything around perpetrator accountability, it's focused on punitive responses administered by the criminal justice system, so reactive measures rather than therapeutic or rehabilitative measures. So I think it partly has to do with the fact that fathers have remained invisible and therefore unaccountable for their behavior. I think the other thing is that there's always been an ongoing tension between funding streams for victim-centered approaches and funding streams for perpetrator-centered approaches. And I think unless we see government commitment to funding a perpetrator-centered approach in addition to a victim-centered approach, the problem is always that there's tensions and perceptions around that funding being taken away from victim-centered approaches and diverted towards perpetrator ones, and then there's little support because we know at the bottom level, in order to establish initial safety and protection, we need those victim-centered approaches. While in the long run, obviously, working with perpetrators is the answer because they're the ones that need to change their behavior. We can't expect victims to continuously, protect themselves and protect their children. And then we've got a question around cultural appropriateness. Very good question. I think most of the evaluations have come out of the US and Canada simply because they've had perpetrator programs in more consistent shape or form for so long. And one of the recommendations that frequently comes out of it that it needs to have a cultural appropriate consideration. To what extent we see that here, I couldn't really say. I suspect it's very limited, and it's certainly a very important point to raise, because I think for immigrant families, for example, where perpetrators, where the violence is anchored in particular cultural beliefs, values, and structures, that obviously needs to be addressed even more so before you can move on to addressing any other of the complex issues. And I think in terms of working with Indigenous perpetrators, victims, or families as a whole, there's a lot for us to learn from those interventions that we already see that are culturally specific and use a more restorative approach, if you want, in terms of Indigenous sentencing courts, for example, that really teach us the importance of cultural appropriateness, considering cultural practices, considering community values, considering the importance of family life, family unit, extended family units within the Indigenous communities. Because I think for Indigenous perpetrators, using a mainstream approach would be completely unsuitable. While there's certainly value in some of the components that we see in those mainstream approaches, raising the issue of cultural appropriateness and suitability and consent consideration is certainly a really important one. And then somebody asked, how can we see longer-term or longer dosage treatment programs taking place when custodial sentences are so short for breaches? Does this highlight the need for more community-based integrated programs and services? Yes, absolutely. I think in general, obviously, if perpetrators get sentenced to lengthy custodial sentences, then they should certainly be engaging in an intervention program that's offered in custody. We know that those are even more limited than the ones outside of custody. And with this particular program that we examined, for example, some of the men had served longer custodial sentences and were then sent into the program post-release because there was nothing on offer during the actual custodial sentence. I think the other thing is that any type of perpetrator intervention and focus on engagement as father. So from both perceptions, the perpetrator interventions from a criminal justice system in terms of behavior change program, but also the child safety component of working with families, complex family needs, high-risk families around child welfare, need to be part of an integrated response, because if we don't have that holistic approach, we'll continue to see those different types of agencies or organizations working in their own silos, focusing on the mandate of the right of the child, for example, focusing on the mandate around punitive or reactive responses to offending behavior. And it doesn't have the accountability at the holistic level. I think the other thing that we really know out of the international evidence base is that any perpetrator intervention program should really be part of an integrated response that also has a victim advocacy component to be able to cross-check safety issues, family welfare issues, child well-being with both parties, and not relying either on services working with victims and not engaging with perpetrators, or on perpetrator intervention programs being separated somewhere in a community-based setting, for example, and not being linked to victim advocacy service. I think the evidence really shows that accountability, in a sense of social accountability, but also criminal justice accountability, works better when the perpetrator intervention program is integrated into a holistic approach that also has a victim advocacy component. Somebody's asking about the best place to get training to deal with perpetrators of domestic violence. Again, very limited at the moment. I believe there's only one university in Australia that offers an accredited program, and we're currently working on developing another one. But that obviously won't help you until next year, the earliest. In general, I think it might be worthwhile looking into what's currently available in terms of online training. I'm happy for you to send me an email, and I can provide you with some more information around what's currently accredited and what we're currently developing if you're interested. That's Sharon. Oh, and maybe following up on that question too, in the meantime, in terms of reading, I think there's a lot of value in looking at the Duluth model, for example. While it's very criminal justice centered, it certainly takes that underlying feminist framework, and it has that victim advocacy component as part of a coordinated response, and provides some information on how to work with perpetrators, for example. As I said, a minimum status, non-prohibited, or any basis for endorsing such programs. Okay, so a question on minimum standards around men's program and what they have to meet, or the basis for endorsing such programs. I would have to admit I don't know. I suspect there's either none or it is very limited, because when we look at what we have in terms of perpetrator interventions across Australia, they differ greatly in terms of quality, in terms of the qualifications of facilitators, in terms of, whether they are a few weeks, a few months, or whether they run for half a year. In terms of what evaluation findings suggest is the longer the better. So a lot of the evaluations suggest that anything under 18, 20 weeks has very limited, if any, effect in terms of behavior change. I think the other recommendation around minimum standards for facilitators, aside from adequate training, is that they always should be co-facilitated by a male and female facilitator, because the argument is that a male facilitator only or a female facilitator only running those type of intervention programs around male privilege and male entitlement are ineffective, because a female facilitator is likely to not get the same kind of access to perpetrators who have or might have, to some extent, patriarchal views on the role of women. But being run solely by a male perpetrator also doesn't bring in that female component and that feminist framework around accountability and gender stereotypes within intimate relationships. So that's one of the other, minimum standards, or at least recommendations around effectiveness. And then the other thing, I think, in terms of inconsistency, is that a lot of programs that call themselves perpetrator or behavior change programs don't necessarily have that underlying feminist framework, which is problematic, given that we know from the research that to some extent, even if there's no pattern of coercive control involved, to a great extent, beliefs of male privilege, male entitlement, and beliefs around stereotypical gender roles and women as subordinate within the intimate relationships are prominent in the majority of perpetrators in general, and particularly those that then actually come in contact with the criminal justice system and go through intervention programs. And then a question, so would I agree that it should meet minimum standards? Yes, definitely. I think otherwise it is a waste of time and funding and resources if it doesn't meet minimum standards that we at least know from the international evidence base make these types of programs work, make these types of programs worthwhile in terms of being able to generate behavior change, but also establish victims' and children's safety, beyond that initial engagement and monitoring within a perpetrator intervention program. Okay, from what I can see, those were all the questions, unless I've missed something. Anybody, if you've got any questions that you would like to follow up on more in depth, I'm more than happy for you to send me an email. My email address is at the bottom of the slide at the end. So I'm more than happy for you to get in touch if you're interested and see if I can provide any more in-depth information around something that you're interested in.
Okay, thank you, Silke. We would like to thank Dr. Silke Meyer for her presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Silke can be contacted via the email address provided in her closing slide should you have any follow-up questions regarding this presentation. You will now be redirected to a short exit survey. We ask that you please complete the survey, as your feedback is very important to us, the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research, and of course to Silke. Wish you a pleasant day and hope to see you all again very soon.